So in order to swing that, Overton window back to more of an individualist and a liberty-minded sense of view, we need to educate at least one or two or three generations of school children to bring that back to a point of logic and normalcy. So that is the problem that we're facing right here. It's not just like, oh, vote for Pierre Poilievre and he's going to fix everything. No, because the problem is with the people itself.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Johnny Says So. And my guest today is Kevin, who runs the Twitter handle Govt.exe is corrupt. And if you've been watching the show, you've probably seen this name come up a few times because I like to reference his tweets. They're often right on point and often hilarious, even though it deals with something that's not so funny, which is the downfall of Canada and the complete lack of liberty that is very present in this country. So, Gov, man, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem, man. So right off the bat, I kind of want to, I had something prepared that tweet of yours from last week that I wanted to talk about, but something that you just posted before this interview was absolutely hilarious that I think, let's talk about this, man. You wrote, Elizabeth May just had a stroke after she saw what Doug Ford did to that bottle of Crown Royal. And I think that's a perfect place to start there. So if anybody hasn't seen it, do you want to explain what Doug Ford did today?
Yeah, so Doug Ford, after pounding his chest about pulling the American whiskey off of the LCBO shelves, a week ago or so, Crown Royal said that they're moving, and it's not even they're moving their entire operations, right? They're just moving their U.S. operations, the portion of which gets sold in the United States. They're moving that bottling to the United States. So they're not even moving everything to the U.S. It's just whatever is being shipped to the U.S. right now. That bottling facility is being shut down in Ontario and moving to the United States. So Doug Ford lost his mind, and he got out in front of the press today. And last week it was Campbell's Soup. This week it was Crown Royal, and he basically dumped. I think it was a 60, a 60-pounder. And it took him 7 minutes to dump it because he couldn't figure out how to pull the plastic cap off. So, he was dumping it for a very long time, and just making a complete fool of himself. And, alcohol all over the place for what? Crown Royal is, I believe it comes from Manitoba. Most of it is still being bottled in Quebec. It's just, nonsensical virtue signaling from Doug Ford. And I posted about Elizabeth May as a joke because everybody knows that she's a drunken train wreck.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And this whole everything Doug Ford is doing right now with it's not just the Crown Royal, but he has pulled all American alcohol off of the shelves in Ontario. And that's not the only province, by the way. I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most provinces in Canada have done the same. I know in BC you can't. Here in Nova Scotia, our tin pot tyrant Tim Houston has done the exact same. All American alcohol is off of the shelves. So, yeah, Doug Ford is absolutely making a fool of himself, and for what?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? I don't really know. He's aligning himself with the Carney Liberals. He aligned himself with the Trudeau Liberals. It could be a play for him to be prime minister, because it's only a matter of time before he's no longer premier of Ontario, right? Maybe he has his eyes set out on as being prime minister. Who really knows? So yeah, that's and the irony of the whole thing is, and I did post this last week, is how come I can't buy Jack Daniel's whiskey, but I can buy Tsingtao beer, which is coming from China, and China has tariffs on Canada. I thought this was about protecting our sovereignty, standing up for Canada. China has police stations in Canada, over a dozen of them. The RCMP won't tell us how many or where they are, but the fact that they're they're tight-lipped about it just tells us that they're here, they're operating, and their primary premise is to target, Chinese dissidents. And it is an attack on our sovereignty if you if you say the 51st state is an attack on our sovereignty, then so is, having Chinese police stations on, Canadian soil an attack on our sovereignty. They have tariffs on pork. They have tariffs on soybean. And a plethora of other things, and their tariffs. So it's just inconsistent here. So it has really nothing to do with standing up for our sovereignty. If I can buy Tsingtao beer, but I can't buy Jack Daniels, when both countries are quote unquote attacking our sovereignty as the media would portray. So just the hypocrisy of the whole thing, it doesn't really make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense one bit, and the hypocrisy of promoting Canadian steel, and to use a phrase you just used, virtue signaling about Canadian jobs in the steel sector while allowing Chinese shipbuilders to build ferries for BCs, I think is absolutely laughable.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think that, and I think that got federal approval too. I think Mark Carney signed off on that, to outsource the ferries to China instead of building them here locally.
Yeah, so we can't buy products that we want because our provincial governments are essentially forcing us to boycott our closest economic, military, and cultural ally. And so this doesn't seem conducive to liberty to me. And I want to get to the heart of the matter here because this is what you put out last week, which kind of spawned me to contact you for this interview. You wrote, "At what point do we stop saying Canada is becoming a communist country and start saying Canada is a communist country?" Now, in the past, I might have pushed back on this narrative just a little bit. I think, like, as recently as COVID, it would bother me when people would, like, in real life, but mostly in, like, online discussions, people would be on our quote unquote side, would be expressing, their discontent with vaccine mandates and lockdowns and whatnot. And they would say, this is communism. And at the time, I would sort of be like, like maybe you could make a better argument than that. Maybe you could express why you don't like lockdowns or vaccine mandates. I would prefer the word authoritarianism or totalitarianism. But as time goes on and I start to see what's going on with this trade war, and I'm being forced into boycotting products that I want, and everything that we've seen so far from Mark Carney, I'm really starting to come along to the idea that it could be one or the other. So what do you think, Gov? Do you think we are becoming a communist country, or do you think we're already there?
Well, if you take a look at the economics from the USSR, at the peak of the USSR, the country's GDP from the public sector was roughly about 65 to 70%. Our GDP from the public sector right now is about 45%. So we're two-thirds of the way to USSR style economy. And when now Mark Carney talking about we're just going to sever ties with the United States and become our own best customer. That's a direct quote. Canada is a commodity country. We have to export, so we can import things that we don't produce, that we can't produce, or it's too expensive to produce. So if now we're basically cutting off ties to our biggest customer, it's like if you were running a store and you said, you know what, I don't really want to sell to buyers anymore. We're just going to sell to our employees. That's basically what we're doing here. So, if we're not exporting, then we won't be able to import. And that's the whole point. So we can't be our own best customer. We can't support our economy on 40 million people after shunning 350 million people. So that this only will lead to an increase in public sector GDP. So the public sector is now going to take on more slack as the private sector starts to deteriorate. So that will actually increase the amount of public sector GDP, pushing us further towards that USSR style economy. But the only issue is, we can call it communism, we can call it totalitarianism, we can call it authoritarianism, but I really think that they took the absolute worst of each authoritarian system and kind of merge it together into one, because what we've kind of, this is like a melting pot of isms, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be far worse than communism is. It's, one thing Russia never did, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, the USSR never did. They didn't, open up their borders to, third world migrants, and flood their economy with mass immigration. I don't think they did that. I don't think they destroyed their culture through mass immigration. So honestly, what I see here is, sure, we are a communist state because there are no free markets. We don't have sound money. We don't have limited government. But it's kind of like maybe communism on steroids. I don't even know what would be the appropriate moniker to label it as, but it's like communism with mass immigration, which everybody knows that when you can have a welfare state, you can have open borders, but you can't really have both. That's the quickest way to economic suicide. So not only are we doing that, we're increasing the size of the public sector. So it's basically like a double whammy. It's actually worse than communism.
Yeah, and when you mentioned, the prospect of the public sector getting bigger, I'm sort of like scratching my head wondering how the public sector in this country could possibly get any bigger, is what I'm trying to say. Like, how many, like, what's the percentage of Canadians, like employed Canadians, that work for the federal or provincial government? It's staggering last time I
It's
checked.
about it's it's about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 employed Canadians work in the public sector, whether that's provincial, federal, or municipal, or town governments. So it's like 1 in 4, 1 in 5, and don't forget, 40% or 45% of Canadians don't pay any income taxes at all, right? So if you have, 8 million people not paying income taxes, then you have another, 4.5, 5 million people that work for the government. They're paid through taxation. So, there's no productivity there. So, basically all those people are reliant on the private sector, which is being systematically destroyed, systematically attacked. And so, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with Frederick Hayek, but, he outlined this in The Road to Serfdom, in a book that he wrote many decades ago. And this is the road that we're traveling on. Canada's traveling down the road to serfdom.
Road to Serfdom. I'll have to check that one out. But you were saying that you're not sure which ism we are headed towards exactly, whether it be communism, fascism, totalitarianism. I would argue that we're, like, obviously, this doesn't invoke images of World War II or anything. I don't think we're that far gone yet. But I mean, fascism really, you could make a case for that as well, because what fascism is, one of the cornerstones of it, is the merger of corporate and state power. And if COVID taught me anything, I think we're pretty much already there. I mean, we were essentially mandated by the government to take an experimental pharmaceutical product by some of the worst offenders in corporate history. Like Pfizer, I think, hands down, has the record for most amount of lawsuits against them, right? So there's an argument to be made there.
Yeah, no, definitely. What we saw during COVID was, textbook fascism. That was the actual definition, and it leads to, like, political implications and political fallout. And they like to change the definition of, fascism, but, Mussolini and Giovanni Gentili's definition was, the best and the most eloquent as, the merger of state and corporate powers. And that's exactly what we've seen. And again, another winner in economics, in the 40s. And he said, there's not really much difference between fascism and socialism. He puts fascism on the left. It's an authoritarian socialist and an authoritarian collectivist ideology. It has nothing to do with far right, in my opinion, and in Frederick Hayek's opinion as well.
That's a really interesting perspective, because I've heard this argument made before, and yeah, I want to get into this, man, because, like, it's the political spectrum that we were all taught, and a lot of us still go by, unfortunately, is just this really narrow worldview of left to right, right? Like the way we see it now is obviously you have communism over here on the far left, and then the closer you get to center is more like reasonable civil society. So you got communism on the far left, then you have your socialism, then you have what it means to be a Democrat, or like NDP, I guess would be more relevant for us. And then supposedly in the central, you have liberals, like capital L liberals. And then the further right you get less government. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the spectrum, we're led to believe you get the most government possible, which is an authoritarian regime. And I don't know, like I've always accepted this worldview. And lately, I'm just beginning to question how the further away you get from government control, right? Because the left is all about government control. The right supposedly is about less government, and I can't reconcile how fascism ends up on the right. So is this like historical revisionism done on purpose?
Well, if you take a look at it, if you put if we want to just do a scale as a linear scale, which we can make an argument all day long that the, the political spectrum isn't linear. But if we want to make it a linear scale, we would put communism on the left, anarchy on the right, capitalism on the right, and fascism in the middle. So, if you want to have no government, free market, sound money, no corporate government, corporate and private and public sector merger, that would be like an anarcho-capitalist society. And then as soon as you start to introduce a state into that, that is introducing a fascist ideology, because now once you introduce a state, you're going to start to introduce the marriage between that state and corporations or companies that exist within that economy, and now you have the birth of fascism. So fascism can be on both sides of the political spectrum. It's just that the larger that influence between the state and the corporate entities become, the more the more to the left you're that fascist point of view is going to be pushed, to the point where you have basically fascio anarcho capitalism on the right, and then you have fascio communism on the left. So fascism is just basically a moving needle between the two endpoints, which is communism, 100% government control, and anarchy, which is zero government control. And in between, you have this massive buffer, what you can label as fascism.
Okay, so maybe there is something to horseshoe theory then. Like the further you get on the extremes, it's just going to bend back and end up in the same place, right?
It's possible, but my point of view is the less government, obviously, the better, and no government would ultimately be the best, but everybody would say that no government would lead to chaos. And I agree that in a demoralized society, and in a society that is has been removed of all morals, that if you remove the state, if you remove that authority figure, that it would lead to chaos, and there would be, mass violence, and, probably, a lot of looting, and a lot of, bad things that happen. But in a moral society where people actually know right and wrong, basically, don't steal from people, don't hurt them, don't take their things, yada yada yada, don't trespass on their property, don't try to kill them. In a moralized society, anarchy would work just great. But the problem is that over the last few decades, probably even longer, but just in this recent time, over the last few decades, the demoralization of our society has been, absolutely fantastic, to quote Yuri Bezmenov. And it's at first it takes a long time, and I'm not too sure if you're familiar with Yuri Bezmenov's work. I'm sure you are, and I'm sure your audience is. But the primary objective is to capture the public education system and educate one generation of school children, and expose them to the ideology of the enemy, and in this case is the Marxist Leninist ideology has been exposed to at least 3, 4, 5 generations of school children, and one generation trains another, which trains another, and then once you have a multi-generational pattern, then you start to have tradition. So the demoralization aspect of Canada, United States, the Western world is complete, and it's irreversible. In order to turn the tide back to a sense of liberty and a sense of individualism and a sense of freedom, you would need the equal and opposite amount of time. So everybody's saying, "Oh, we just got to, vote a new government in, or kick this guy out and kick this guy in." But that doesn't work, because the people have been demoralized, and their process, their way of thinking. You can't prove black is black. You can't prove white is white. Even if you shower them with authentic proof and information, you can't change their basic logic or their pattern of thinking. So in order to swing that Overton window back to more of an individualist and a liberty-minded sense of view, we need to educate at least 1 or 2 or 3 generations of school children to bring that back to a point of logic and normalcy. So that is the problem that we're facing right here. It's not just like, oh, vote for Pierre Poilievre and he's going to fix everything. No, because the problem is with the people itself.
Yeah, that's a pretty nihilistic and black-pilled way to look at it. But I think, unfortunately, I think you've definitely got something there. And as far as Pierre Poilievre goes, I mean, it's a pretty sad state of affairs when this is pretty much the hope that a lot of Canadians are, setting their watch to at this point. Like, I know I voted for him last election, just, out of a lack of any other options. I think that I try not to make perfect the enemy of good when it comes to Pierre Poilievre. I mean, even if he does 4 out of the 10 things that he says he's going to, it would pretty much be a good step towards some sort of damage mitigation. And I think that's the best we can hope for at this point, unfortunately, politically in this country. Would you agree?
Well, being from an anarcho-capitalist point of view, and I'm not too sure if you're going to agree with my point of view here, but I think that the only thing that will that causes humans to have drastic change is through pain. And that's why the Freedom Convoy was so successful. That's why millions of people showed up, either in person or online through social media and connected. It was because the vaccine mandates and restrictions, it actually hurt a lot of people. Not maybe not physically, but I'm sure some physically, but a lot emotionally, a lot financially, a lot spiritually. And this Freedom Convoy thing came out, and it was like a way to vent that pain and connect. That's why it was so successful. So a vast majority of Canadians were exposed to a lot of psychological pain, right? I remember, in 2020, 2021, I wasn't able to, go see my dying grandfather because, I wasn't vaccinated. I wasn't able to go. I was limited to only going to the gas station and the grocery store. I wasn't able to go to restaurants or whatnot. And, there were curfews because I was in Quebec at the time. So, and then this, I guess this light in a sea of darkness showed up, and it gave people hope, right? That's why it was so successful. So there was a lot of pain that came out before this movement happened, and I think that this is something that's going to happen on a grand scale. In order for Canadians or this country to actually, shift and change our, ideological point of view, is through, economic pain. So basically, things are going to have to get a lot worse before they can get better. So it's more like the accelerationist, point of view. Put in the absolute worst person who can bring about the most amount of damage in the shortest period of time, and actually expose people to this, economic pain, and then maybe we can actually change. But it's kind of like a kid riding a bike, right? He's all excited. He's not going to learn anything until he falls off his bike and bumps his head a few times, that maybe he needs to wear a helmet. And we're a relatively new country. We really haven't been exposed to economic pain that countries like Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic or Argentina or Venezuela, a lot of South American countries who have gone through this pain. Canadians don't know anything about that, and that is call it black pill, but I think it's just coming to the realization that that is the only thing that changes human behavior is pain.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summation of what's going on, as a matter of fact. And as far as somebody coming in and accelerating things to the point where most Canadians feel pain, I thought we were getting there with Justin Trudeau, but Mark Carney seems to be a rapid continuation of that. And I think you might be onto something. I think we're everything I've seen seems to indicate that we are headed in that direction. He doesn't seem to have any sort of desire to actually do the things that are needed to quote unquote build Canada strong. All he does is fly around all summer, visiting his old pals in the European Union, making speeches, making grand promises about energy products. Like he almost sounds like Trump in a way. Like if you take out, Trump's voice, the likes of which you've never seen, we're building things so quickly. You know what I mean? Like he's saying that we're going to see projects built, housing, infrastructure, energy at rates we've never seen before in this country. And I'm not seeing it. Are you? Like, is this guy all talk or what?
Well, that's the Marxist ideology coming out of them. You don't even actually have to deliver these things. All you have to do is promise them, promise the world, promise this utopian dream, and then when they don't come to fruition, you just blame somebody else. Just say, oh, it was this guy's fault. We're in a crisis now, and so that's we have to keep in mind that a large percentage of Canadians, they work on emotion, and very and a relatively small percentage actually works on logic. And the logical people say this guy is crazy, but the emotional people, they actually believe this. They jump on the bandwagon, and the same stupid people that jump on the last bandwagon and got burned are going to jump on the next bandwagon. And when I talk about economic pain, the problem is here there's a large percentage of the population who have a public pension, who work for the government their whole lives, because there's a lot of them, who own their own homes, are now millionaires, and they're never going to see this pain. They're in their 40s, they're in their 50s, they're in their 60s, they're in their 70s, and their net worth is 1.5, 2.5, $3 million because of their pensions and their real estate. But the next generation, they don't have that, and they're never going to get that. And if the boomers die off, and they leave that wealth to the next generation, I'm sure that the government is going to come in and do a luxury tax, or a capital gains on your primary residence tax, and they're going to try and take that. They're gonna come for it, and they want it all back, right? So that's the pain that I'm talking about, and that's why I don't think it's gonna happen in 4 years from now or in 8 years from now. This is why I think this is going to take another decade or 2 decades to actually play out. And earlier when you asked about Pierre Poilievre and its hope, personally I believe that Canada as it stands right now, the balkanization of Canada is inevitable, because you speak to people from St. John, from St. John in New Brunswick, or from somewhere in Quebec, Montreal, and you speak to somebody in Calgary, Alberta, or in BC, and their thought process, the way they see the world, the world views are completely different. There's a divide between Eastern Canada and Western Canada. So in 20, 30 years, will Canada as a country even exist? Will there be even a federal government, or will it break apart into regional provinces, or will it be absorbed into a North American Union? Something that's been talked about for a very long time, where the Canadian dollar, the US dollar, and the Mexican peso are all gone, and it gets replaced by the Amero. The U.S. Constitution is gone. The Charter of Rights is gone, and a new constitution is formulated, obviously to the benefit of the technocrats or the kleptocrats or the plurocrats, and in the ushering in of a two-tier feudal system. That is what they want. That is their end goal, is a North American Union. And that's why everybody's talking about we need to become the 51st state. And I don't think that's a very good idea, because that is the furthering of globalization, and that is the absolute opposite that we want. What we want is to remain a sovereign country and maintain a trade relationship with the United States, but not be absorbed by them.
Yeah, man, you hit the nail on the head. That's a point that I've been making over and over again. And yeah, that was very well articulated. I like that you said North American Union too, because that is something that I have not heard in a very long time. So I sort of cut my teeth on politics like way back in the day. I say way back in the day, but I'm relatively young. I'm almost 40. But I don't know how long you've paid attention to this stuff, but like in the early 2000s, like mid 2000s, around the time the Iraq War happened, Alex Jones and people like that were really beating the drum about the North American Union. And at the time, it was a lot of people just sort of dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. And that was something that like the quote unquote conspiracy theorists were always warning about. And I find it really funny that like, a lot of the same people, all it took was the host of The Apprentice becoming president of the United States, and all of a sudden the 51st state is a good idea, which I find very strange to me. Yeah, like I don't think it's a good idea. I agree with you there 100%. In a lot of ways, I admire the United States of America, but to the same point, I don't particularly want to move there unless things get really bad. I'd like to hopefully fight for the country that used to exist, maybe never existed, but I think life has potential to be really good here. But it's just we've lost our way in a sense.
And I understand the point, the point of view that a lot of people, how they want to become, the part of the 51st state, part of the United States. Like, I understand it. If you think about it, like we're in an abusive relationship with our own governments, right? So, we've been, we're taxed to death. We're, uh, banned from doing this, not allowed to do that. So it's like we're in an actual abusive relationship, and we want to leave that relationship. But the problem is the United States is just as abusive. So that's just leaving from one abusive relationship to another. Sure, they have the Constitution, and they have the First Amendment, and they have the Second Amendment, but Washington D.C. is just as big of a swamp, if not bigger, than Ottawa. So why do we want to jump out of the frying pan into the fire? What we want to do is take what maybe the founding fathers wanted 200 years ago with their Declaration and the Bill of Rights, and maybe create our own republic around that. But what America is today is nothing what the founding fathers envisioned. What in the 1700s, and if they seen how big of take a look at Donald Trump's big beautiful bill. It promised to spend more money than any other bill in American history, and that is not the purpose. Your goal is not to increase government. Your goal is to decrease or try to even eliminate it. But don't brag about the billions and the trillions of dollars that you're trying to spend, because So the founding fathers would take a look at the United States right now, and they'd be like, oh my God, militarized police, centralized control, a central bank with the Federal Reserve, um, everything that they fought against. In trying to leave England has shown up on the American shores. Don't forget the primary reason for the American Revolution was to detach the colonies from the oppressive British central bank, because they ultimately forced the colonies into debt by borrowing from the Bank of England, and not being able to create their own debt-free currencies, which they saw central banks as more dangerous to your freedoms and liberties than standing armies. So that was the primary reason for revolt. And then you can people talk about the Boston Tea Party and whatnot, the 2% tax, but the primary reason was the oppressive central bank. And how long did it take for America to establish a central bank? I think two or three central banks came up and failed before. I think two came up and failed before the creature from Jekyll Island was unleashed in 1913. So
Yeah, Woodrow
if you want
Wilson, right?
yeah, so if you want like a free society, if you want liberty and independence, first of all, you need to have sound money. And if you have a central bank, you don't have sound money. You need to have limited government, and you need to have free markets. There's no free markets in Canada. There's no free markets in the United States. There's no sound money, and there is massive government. So why would I want to leave from one country with massive government to another country? And you can't drain the swamp. That's the problem. People are saying, "Oh, we got to drain the swamp." The problem is you send in somebody to drain the swamp, and they become the swamp creature. Everything that Trump was talking about in 2015, 2016, um, he's become a swamp creature. And I know a lot of people are fans of his, and I understand why. But if I were to place Trump on the political spectrum, he's a moderate leftist. So wait till you see somebody like Melee. If you want to have economic reform, get a guy like an anarcho-capitalist like Melee in there from Argentina, and really take the chainsaw to the state. That's something Melee is your if dot Melee is the Ferrari. The Dodge is like a Honda Civic, right? You need to go way farther into cutting down and tearing down the state than what is happening, and ultimately that is the solution. Is the decentralization of our of our economy, because so if we want to move to more of a freedom and liberty point of view, we need mass decentralization. And it's not just the government, it's all establishments. It's our educational system, it's our healthcare systems, it's our it's everything. But and it's going to be inevitable, but the road that it's going to take to get there, I'm not going to lie, it's going to be bumpy. It's going to be a rough ride.
Yeah, it's going to be an extremely rough ride. But yeah, I'd like to unpack some of what you said there with like the big beautiful bill. It's just that was quite eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people, which I found honestly, I find it really optimistic how many people like that voted for Donald Trump are now like speaking out against him, because when Elon Musk jumped ship, that was like a big red flag for a lot of people. I mean, how do you go from, I know there's a lot more to it than what you said with the 2 or 3% tax on tea with the Boston Tea Party, but like how do you go from a population that was willing to revolt over essentially a 2% tax on tea to just blindly clapping along to the big beautiful bill? It's completely antithetical to everything that Donald Trump campaigned on about draining the swamp, small government, this and that, making America great again. And it's just it's it makes me optimistic to see so many people like pushing back on it, but I'm also disappointed that so many people still support him over this.
Yeah, well, honestly, like every political movement is has its cult-like behavior, right? So, there's going to be your diehard supporters that will never jump ship, and then there's going to be your fringe supporters that are going to jump ship relatively early as soon as they, start to see some, warning signs. Um, but unfortunately, there are still a lot of diehard supporters, and they're going to support him for whatever he does, to the grave. Just like there are diehard Trudeau supporters, just like there are diehard Pierre Poilievre supporters, just like there are diehard Maxime Bernier supporters. Every political party has this cult-like behavior, and it's very similar to sports. It's like the Toronto Maple Leafs versus the Montreal Canadiens versus it's cult like behavior. And I guess it can go back to it's gladiator times. It's modern day Colosseum, but instead of being swords and axes, it's words, and it's happening in front of a plastic pulpit, instead of like on a TV screen, instead of like a few thousand people live. But it's the same concept. It's that's my guy. I'm going to root for him. I don't really care. He's my guy. And again, logic is out the window. And of course, it doesn't work for everybody, but I think a large percentage of the population actually falls into these collectivist buckets. And I don't really know what the solution is to that. I think that's just basic human nature.
Yeah, 100%. I'm glad you drew the analogy with sports there because that's 100% what it is. It's bread and circus. I have images in my head of people in a stadium. They're like they make these very simple symbols almost on purpose. You know what I mean? Like you've got your red jerseys, you got your blue jerseys, and I like to say I'm above it all. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I don't watch sports. Like, I don't care about the sports ball game. But at the same point, like, oh, the debate's on tonight. You know what I mean? That's me. So like, I can admit that I fall into this stuff myself too. Um, yeah. Do you see any way out of this politically?
There's no political solution, but that's just if you take a look at my logo on X, I have the anarchist logo. So I don't really know if you take what an anarchist says with a grain of salt, but I don't think that there's any voting your way out of this, right? You can't vote your way out of tyranny. And I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So and you're only seven generations away from totalitarianism. I think these are some of the quotes coming from the founding fathers, and so it's going to come to a point where there's going to be a mass revolt, because the people can only be pushed so far. And I was in sales for a very long time, and I remember the story. We would meet in the morning, and we would tell each other a story, like a motivational story. And there's this one story that really stuck out for me. It was a guy was walking down the street, and he heard a whimper as he was walking by somebody's house, and it was like a dog whimpering, and he thought nothing of it. But he went back the next day, and the dog was still whimpering, and it was a little bit louder. And he's like, "Oh, well, that dog seems like in a little bit of pain, but it should be okay." And the next day, the dog was whimpering again, but louder still. And this happened for like a few days, maybe a week, and it got to the point where the dog was howling and howling. So the guy knocks on the owner's door and said, your dog sounds like he's in a lot of pain. And the owner said, yeah, his ass is on a nail. It's just not enough pain for him to get off and do anything about it. So uh, that's where I think we are right now. We're basically our ass is a nail is up our ass, but it's just not painful enough for us to do anything about it. But when that time happens, there's going to be a snapback moment, and that's where we're going to reach the anger stage of the awakening phase, where even the most blind people are going to be hit with a new paradigm, and that new paradigm is going to overwhelm any any action, and it usually would lead to self-destructive behavior, right? They won't be able to see how they were lied to for so long, and they won't be able to believe anything that they see. They won't no longer trust anything that they hear, um, and their emotions will cause them to self-destruct. So that is the path that we're leaving on right now. And again, this is not going to happen like tomorrow or next week. This is a macro version of it, but you're going to have massive self-destructive behavior from the people that were not prepared and had no idea of what was coming, and then you're going to have logical reactions from people that understood what was coming and were prepared for it to happen, and we're just waiting for society to collapse on itself and rebuild on the other side. I'm sure you heard of the fourth turning, right? If you take a look at it, everything is cyclical, right? You have summer follows spring, and autumn follows summer, and then winter follows autumn. But after winter comes spring again. So I believe that in this economic point of view, we're in the winter of this lifetime. So winter comes death, but after winter comes spring, becomes rejuvenation, becomes life. So there is going to be that pain as we move through winter, but as spring approaches, as the days become longer and the snow starts to melt and the grass starts to grow and the crops start to come again, it's going to bring about a new wave of prosperity. So again, it's all cyclical. It's just unfortunate that these cycles are not weeks and months, but they're years and decades. Maybe a season, an economic season, could be 80 to 100 years, right? So and us being in the winter of the season, it just means that this could happen, persist for a long time. But maybe in 2-3 generations from now, our kids, our grandkids, or their kids, there's going to be a lot of prosperity and a lot of opportunity, but we just have to go through this winter cycle, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I'm picking up what you're putting down. So basically, you're saying that in order for like the critical mass of most Canadians to wake up and see what's going on, we're gonna have to see bread lines first, basically, and we're just gonna
Yeah,
blindly
bread
allow
line.
ourselves to get to that point. Most
Yeah,
people are, at
yeah,
least.
we will. Yeah, we will. We will. We will.
Damn. Yeah, and I want to bring it back to what you. It was just sort of like an offhand comic you said, or comment you said, when you said, not sure if you take the opinion of an anarchist seriously. But I want to get back to the concept of anarchy, because you are talking about like the true, actual form of anarchy, right? Total
Yeah.
freedom. And I find it really funny because I know your Twitter handle has the anarchy symbol in yellow, and I grew up listening to a lot of punk rock, so like the punk rockers, they've sort of co-opted that symbol, which I find really funny, because if you look at punk rock now, it's almost about obeying the establishment, right? Like, I just find it really funny that like a lot of bands that I grew up on, like, and punk rockers in
Like,
general, like they'll sport the anarchy, they'll have anarchy pins, and then that'll be right next to their "I got my COVID vax" pin. Their trans flag, their pronouns. You know what I mean? It's just another hilarious example of things being co-opted in this culture, and just
Yeah, yeah, but if you take a look at, not all anarchy is created equal. You could just say that anarchy, but there's multiple forms of anarchy. And you mentioned that mine is the yellow flag, and that's yellow is anarcho-capitalism. But I'm sure you've seen the red and black anarchy flag, and that's anarcho-communism, right? So those are the two opposite sides of the anarchist political spectrum: anarcho-communism on the left side, far left, and anarcho-capitalism on the far right. Uh, so if you ever see an anarchy logo with a black and red, the red means communism, and the yellow means capitalism, anarcho-capitalism, which is what Maury Rothbard talked about, versus the the Antifa. If you take a look at the Antifa flag, it's the red and black. That's anarcho-communism. That's why I said, "Oh, we're not fascists." Well, of course you're not fascists. You're anarcho-communists, right? That's why they go around and call everybody fascists, because if you're not a communist, you must be a fascist, because to them the political spectrum stops in the center. They have no idea about the right side of the political spectrum, where the far right would be, complete freedom and capitalism, true capitalism, uh, which would be the complete absence of the state, no state intervention, and people coming together voluntarily without the use of force, to enter into agreements, to enter into contracts, without a third party being the government to dictate the rules and whatnot. That would be like a true anarcho-capitalist society, a voluntarist society, with, without the state. So that's where I align, but I understand that achieving that is impossible. It's just as impossible as achieving complete communism, because as soon as you achieve it, it would destroy itself. You'd have agent provocateurs, or you'd have people with different minds of thinking that would want to subvert that system, and try to grow their influence and their affluence. So I'm not blind to the ideology of it, but the reason why I support that anarcho-capitalist point of view is the closer that we can get to that point on the political spectrum, and the longer we can maintain it, the more freedom and liberty we have, and the more freedom and liberty we have, the more prosperous we all can be. Because the one thing that freedom and liberty creates is prosperity. The one thing that control and centralization creates is poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. And bringing it back to what you said about communism there, how it's pretty much destined to fail and collapse in on itself. Sorry. The best example of this, all you need to know about that topic, is Animal Farm by George Orwell. It's just a perfect. It's almost a children's tale, except it gets a little dark for a children's story. But I mean, it's right there. You know what I mean? Like, you have the farm animals, they start their revolution, and then in the end, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but the book is 50 years old, so if you haven't read it by now, in the end, the pigs end up on two legs, just like the humans that they rebelled against. And it's just a perfect summation of how all communist systems are destined to end up. But back to the just the difference between anarcho-communism and anarcho-capitalism. I guess what my point here is, the political spectrum as we know it is almost an oversimplification. And it really, a lot of people do themselves a big disservice when they blindly, identify themselves as liberal or conservative, and they go into their camps and their teams, and that's it. You may be familiar with like alternative views of the political spectrum as well, where you have like not a straight line, but like you have a quadrant, right? So like, to the right at the top.
I'd be on the bottom right, which would be the economic right. Where Ayn Rand would line up. That's where I would line up on the four quadrant.
Yeah, so that would be the yellow, and then opposite to
Yellow.
that would be the green, and on top, like, so it's, for anybody who doesn't know, like, you have your left, your right, and then there's a top-down axis. At the top, you have authoritarianism, and at the bottom, you have libertarianism. And I think that line from top to bottom is way more important than left to right.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
I actually, it's been a while since I actually took one of those little tests, but there's a site called 8 Values. There's like Political Compass. There's a bunch of them where like you answer various vague questions about your worldview, and last time I took the test was probably before COVID, but I actually, surprisingly to my audience, I ended up on the left of the political spectrum, but I was way down at the bottom, like as far away from authoritarianism as you could get. I was like left of center at the very
Libertarian
bottom.
left.
Yeah. So it's like, well, really closer to center, I would say, if I remember correctly. But like, yeah, I think that libertarianism versus authoritarianism is a way better view of looking at the world if you want to simplify it to just a graph or a spectrum, if you will.
Yeah, and if you take a look at the anarcho-capitalist point of view, it falls under the libertarian umbrella. It's just the far right end of the libertarian umbrella. And basically, if people want to label me as, I always take offense when people call me a conservative because I'm not a conservative. I've never voted conservative in my life. The only party I've voted for is the Libertarian Party of Canada. I think that was when I was 18 or 19. So, right out of the gates, I was a libertarian at heart. So, I actually take great offense to people that call me a conservative. Is like, I don't know if you identify as a conservative or not. You just made a
I
point that
don't.
you don't
I don't.
like to
I've
stick
been
labels
identified
to
by
you.
I've been identified as a conservative by a lot of comments on my YouTube channel, usually by people that don't like my content. They're just like, oh, typical conservative. It's just like, well, Pierre Poilievre is the first time I ever voted conservative, actually. Um, I actually. I voted for PPC in 2021, which is like a departure from how I previously voted, and I'm very ashamed to admit I actually voted for Trudeau in 2015 because I wanted legal weed, and well, we all saw how that went. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. I remember that back in 2015, 2014, 2013. I was talking about that, and I said this whole legal weed thing is a ruse. I said it has nothing to do with legalization. It has everything to do with a hostile takeover of an established market in order for control through taxation. And I said it's going to fail. I said it's a stupid idea, and people are going to have less freedoms under legalized weed than they do under a black market. And I don't know if everything came to fruition, but maybe prices came down. But I think it was a very bad idea to push through this legalization. And I always push for decriminalization, not legalization. Being a libertarian, I think that all drugs should be decriminalized. I don't think the government has the right to dictate to people what they can and cannot consume. And I don't think the government should have the right to use force against people, to force to promote their ideology. So, I never was a Trudeau supporter, even from 2015. I said this guy is bad news, and I was young then. I was probably like, that's when I voted Libertarian. I think it was like 18 or something. And right off the bat, I said this guy is going to be really, really bad. Just watch out. And I had no idea how bad he was, but as bad as Justin Trudeau is, I think Carney is worse.
oh, 100%. Trudeau was just the pretty face behind it all. That whole club. You've got your Justin Trudeau, you got Chrystia Freeland, you have Mark Carney. These people have very well established relationships. They've known each other for a very long time. They're all involved in the World Economic Forum. It's just one big club. And I'm struggling to remember like the past, but I don't remember the old guard liberals being this bad. You know what I mean? Like back in the day, you had Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin and those guys. But like, even Justin Trudeau's father was pushing this Marxist nonsense like way back in the day.
Well, if you take a look at Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he was actually NDP, and he knew that he couldn't be elected as Prime Minister of Canada as NDP, so he switched over to the Liberal Party, and you know became elected that way. And I think that was around the same time that you had, the socialized medicine being passed through what's his face, Tommy Douglas. All happened relatively around the same time. So the communist overthrowing of the Canadian economy, basically started in the mid '60s. In 65, 66, 67. So Hill ever since. If you take a look at how much gold Canada had in the mid '60s, we had, I think it was like 500 or 600, maybe even 1,000 times. I don't know the exact number, but the first thing that Pierre Elliott Trudeau started doing. Under I forget the name of the central banker at the time, but under the Bank of Canada, was start selling off our gold reserves, and you know 80% of our gold reserves were actually sold under Jacques Chrétien. Uh, to the point where we had only 3 tons left back when Justin Trudeau took office, and he ended up selling the rest of it under, I think it was Tiff Macklem, who was the Bank of Canada governor at the time, to the point where that we have no gold. So, the decline of our economy, can be basically linked to the decline of our gold reserves, and it really started in the mid '60s.
Yeah, and it's kind of a off-topic aside, but how much gold do you think is in Fort Knox? Because there was talk about
probably nothing.
Trump was talking about auditing Fort Knox at one point there, or maybe that was Elon actually through Doge. But we never really heard anything come to fruition from that. Since Elon Musk and Donald Trump have parted ways.
I think Germany actually called to repatriate their gold because they know that there's no gold in Fort Knox. A lot of people think that Fort Knox is actually in Kentucky, right? But there's the Federal Reserve Bank in New York that holds a lot of gold, but Fort Knox is actually in Kentucky, and I don't think they have any gold.
Wow, I actually didn't know that it was in Kentucky. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I've seen Die Hard 3 too many times. I always thought it was in New York City, but
that's the Federal Reserve Bank.
Okay.
In Die Hard 3. Yeah.
All right. I always thought.
So I don't think there's any gold in Fort Knox.
Damn. Okay. Well, Gov, I think that's a wrap for tonight, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show, dude. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for letting me just rant, but I enjoyed the conversation.
Me too, man. So, do you want to remind the people where they can find you?
Well, my Twitter handle is right there, or sorry, my X handle is right there. If you want to, pop on and you don't have to follow me if you don't want to. It's completely up to you, but just take a look at some of the posts that I put out. I like to put out funny posts, satirical posts, make people laugh, make people think, and a little bit of make people angry all at the same time. So hitting on all the emotional aspects, because at the end of the day, all I want people to do is I want them to think. So I like to put out provocative posts and provocative comments that try to get people to think. And am I right all the time? Absolutely not. But am I going to try to people to think and create a discussion? I think I do a pretty good job at doing that.
I think you do a fantastic job, and keep the humorous posts coming, because all the topics we talked about tonight are very serious. They have real implications for everybody that lives in this country, and most importantly, our children. But hey, man, if you can't laugh along the way, I don't know what we're doing, man. So, dude, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. And that's going to be my show for tonight, guys. Make sure you smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. And most importantly, follow Govt.exe on Twitter. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Johnny from Nova Scotia says thank you. Hey, Johnny from Nouvelle-Écosse, il dit merci, thank you.
Thanks to you. God bless you.
We're from Quebec. Yeah, Quebec.